The cabin sat 6 miles north of Watsonville on the Moss Ranch, a weathered two-room structure where the winter fog crept through gaps in the boards. Inside, on the morning of December 28, 1879, a figure lay dying. Charley Parkhurst, 67 years old, could no longer speak. The cancer that had been eating away at the tongue and throat had taken his voice weeks ago, leaving only the rasping sound of labored breath. Outside the window, coastal live oaks stood dark against the gray December sky. The neighbors, the Harmon family who owned the ranch, had been bringing soup and checking on the old driver every few hours. Frank Woodward, who had been Charley's partner in a cattle venture years earlier, sat by the bedside. Several times in recent days, Charley had beckoned these friends close, seeming to want to say something important, but the words would not come. By late afternoon, the breathing grew shallow and then stopped altogether. Watsonville was a town of barely 1,000 people then, and everyone knew everyone. Within hours, neighbors arrived to perform the customary tasks, laying out the body, washing it, preparing it for burial. What happened next would transform Charley Parkhurst from a respected local character into a national sensation, and the story would be told in newspapers from Sacramento to New York City within 2 weeks. When the neighbors pulled back the bedclothes and began to remove Charley's clothing, they stopped. Then they called for a doctor. Then another doctor. The examinations confirmed what seemed impossible. Charley Parkhurst, who had driven stagecoaches through the Sierra foothills for 3 decades, who had shot and killed at least one bandit, who chewed tobacco and drank whiskey with the roughest teamsters, who was known throughout California as one of the most fearless drivers to ever hold 6-horse reins, had been assigned female at birth. The doctors made a second discovery that deepened the mystery. At some point in Charley's life, probably many years earlier, Charley had given birth to a child. In the cabin, searchers found a small red trunk. Inside it, a baby's dress. By the time the story reached the newspapers, the revelation had already rippled through every saloon and stage station in Santa Cruz County. The question everyone asked was not whether it was true. The physical evidence was indisputable, but how it was possible that no one had known. For more than half a century, Charley Parkhurst had moved through the world as a man. And until the moment of death, the secret had held. The math is staggering. 55 years of presenting as male. 30 years as a professional stagecoach driver. Thousands of passengers carried. Hundreds of trips over mountain roads. Countless nights sleeping in way stations with other drivers, all without discovery. The New York Times, reprinting the San Francisco Call obituary on January 9, 1880, called it the most astonishing case of its kind ever recorded. The article noted that Charley had achieved distinction in an occupation demanding the best physical qualities of nerve, courage, coolness, and endurance. That Charley had succeeded for so long struck observers as almost beyond belief. But the documents tell a different story, one less about deception and more about the fluidity of identity in a place and time when the West was being invented, when people came to California to remake themselves, when questions about a person's past were considered impolite or dangerous to ask. This is the story of how Charlotte Darky Parkhurst became Charley, and what that transformation reveals about the American West, about gender, about survival, and about the distance between myth and documentary reality. The stakes here extend far beyond one person's life. Charley's story offers a window into the brutal economics of 19th century life for women, into the stagecoach business that moved California's gold, into the nature of identity in frontier communities, and into how we remember and teach history today. In California classrooms right now, 4th graders learn about Charley Parkhurst as part of the state's Gold Rush curriculum, included under the Fair Education Act that mandates teaching about LGBT contributions to history. Charley has become a symbol, a teaching tool, a point of pride, and a subject of debate. But before Charley was any of those things, Charley was a person who lived a specific life in specific places on specific dates, and the details matter. This is not a story about discovery in the simple sense, about gold in the ground or opportunity in the West. This is a story about survival by reinvention, about what it cost and what it bought, and about how a 6-decade secret became, in death, impossible to keep. The evidence comes from county records, from voter rolls, from newspaper obituaries, from Stagecoach company ledgers, from the memories of passengers who rode with Charley, from the neighbors who prepared the body for burial. What follows is built from that evidence, with attention to what can be proven and what remains unknown. Charlotte Darky Parkhurst was born on January 17, 1812, in Sharon, Vermont, a hill town in the Connecticut River Valley. Her mother was Mary Morehouse Parkhurst. Her father was Ebenezer Parkhurst. She had 2 siblings, a brother Charles, born in 1811, and a sister Maria, born in 1810. The family did not stay intact. Mary Morehouse Parkhurst died in 1812, the same year Charlotte was born. The following year, Charles died. With their mother gone and their father apparently unable or unwilling to care for them, Charlotte and Maria were sent to an orphanage in Lebanon, New Hampshire, about 30 miles north. Orphanages in New England in the 1810s and 1820s were grim institutions. Children performed labor in exchange for minimal food and shelter. Education was sparse. Girls were trained primarily for domestic service, sewing, washing, cooking, with the goal of placing them as servants in homes. Boys had slightly more options, including apprenticeships in trades. Pay for domestic workers was minimal, opportunities for advancement almost non-existent. A woman working as a seamstress or laundress in the 1820s might earn between $4 and $6 per month, barely enough for food and lodging. By contrast, men in skilled trades could earn $10 to $15 per month, and those in high-demand occupations significantly more. At age 12, in 1824, Charlotte ran away. She left wearing boys' clothing. Whether she had been planning this for months or acted on impulse, the records do not say. What is clear is that she adopted the name Charley and never looked back. She made her way to Worcester, Massachusetts, where she found work at a livery stable. The work was hard, mucking stalls, scrubbing floors, washing carriages, but she earned room and board, and more importantly, she was around horses. Livery stables in the 1820s were the transportation hubs of their day. Stagecoaches arrived and departed daily, carrying mail, passengers, and freight between towns. The drivers were skilled professionals, men who knew how to handle teams of 4 or 6 horses over rough roads in all weather. Young Charley watched them work, studied how they held the reins, how they controlled the horses with voice and whip, how they managed the mechanics of a loaded coach. At some point, the owner of the stable, or perhaps a man who frequented it, took an interest in the hard-working stable hand. His name was Ebenezer Balk. He owned livery stables in Worcester and later in Providence, Rhode Island. Balch apparently believed Charley was a boy, or if he knew otherwise, he kept the knowledge to himself. He began teaching Charley to drive, first with a single horse, then 2 in hand, then 4 in hand, and eventually 6 in hand teams. This was specialized skill requiring years of practice. A 6-horse team pulling a loaded stagecoach required precise coordination. The driver held 6 separate reins, 1 for each horse, managing them with subtle shifts of tension while also using voice commands and the whip. By the early 1830s, Charley had become a professional stagecoach driver on the East Coast. The work paid well, but it was punishing. Drivers sat exposed to weather on the box seat at the front of the coach. They drove 12 to 16 hours at a stretch, stopping only to change horses at relay stations every 10 to 15 miles. Roads were often little more than dirt tracks, muddy in spring, frozen in winter, dusty in summer. Accidents were common. Coaches overturned, horses bolted, wheels broke. But for someone with Charley's skill, the pay could reach $20 to $30 per month, plus tips from passengers. In Providence, Rhode Island, Charley became known as one of the best drivers on the route. City directories from the late 1830s list Charles D. Parkhurst as a coachman at various addresses. College corner of Pine and Dorrance, then North Main Street, then Central Street, then Hay Bossett Street. It was in Providence that Charley may have met Yates E. Birch, who was also working as a stagecoach driver there. Birch was younger, born in 1827, making him 15 years Charley's junior, but both moved in the same circles of drivers and stable hands. This connection would matter later, thousands of miles to the west. In early 1849, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in California. Within months, the news had spread across the country and around the world. California's non-native population, which had been fewer than 15,000 before the discovery, would swell to over 300,000 by 1855. They came by ship around Cape Horn, a journey of 6 months. They came by ship to Panama, crossed the isthmus by land, and took another ship up the coast, a journey of 6 weeks if nothing went wrong. They came overland by wagon train, enduring 6 months of desert, mountains, and constant threat of disease. Among those who came were James Birch and his close friend Frank Stevens, both from Providence. They arrived in Sacramento in the spring of 1849. Birch was 21 years old and engaged to be married to a woman named Julia Chase back in Massachusetts. He had promised her a mansion, and he intended to make good on that promise by finding gold. But like most who came, Birch found that mining was brutal work with uncertain returns. Instead of swinging a pick, he looked around Sacramento and saw a different opportunity. Thousands of miners were arriving by riverboat at Sacramento, the supply center for the gold country. From there, they needed to reach the mining camps in the Sierra foothills, places like Coloma, Mormon Island, Placerville, Grass Valley, Nevada City. Most went on foot. Some had horses. Almost none had wagons. Birch borrowed a ranch wagon, hitched up 4 horses, and in July 1849 stood at the Sacramento levee shouting, "All aboard!" He charged $32 per passenger for the trip to Coloma and Mormon Island, a distance of about 50 miles. This was more than a month's wages for an unskilled worker in pre-gold rush times, but in California in 1849 prices had inflated wildly. Passengers paid. By 1851, Birch had expanded his operation into multiple routes serving the northern mining districts. He had competition. Frank Stevens had started his own pioneer stage line, and there were at least a dozen other small operators. But Birch had vision and ambition. In January 1854, he engineered a merger of several of the largest lines into the California Stage Company, headquartered at the Orleans Hotel in Sacramento. The combined operation ran daily service to virtually every significant mining town in northern and central California. Governor John Bigler, in his annual message to the state legislature in 1855, declared that California could boast of stagecoach service equal to or better than any other state in the Union. This was the world Charley Parkhurst entered around 1851. Some accounts say Charley arrived as early as 1849, traveling on the steamship R.B. Forbes from Boston to Panama, then by another ship to San Francisco. Aboard the Forbes, Charley met John Morton, a San Francisco businessman who ran a drayage company. Morton later recalled Charley as an agreeable traveling companion, and when Charley mentioned plans to drive stage, Morton offered work. Whether Charley connected with James Birch through their Providence acquaintance or through other channels, by 1851 Charley was driving for the California Stage Company, and the legend was beginning to build. The California of the early 1850s was unlike anywhere else in the nation or the world. Population growth was explosive and chaotic. Entire towns sprang up around mine sites and disappeared when the ore ran out. The social order of the East Coast, with its established hierarchies, its scrutiny of origins, its rigid expectations, did not transplant well to a place where half the population had arrived in the last 2 years, and almost everyone was trying to reinvent themselves. Men who had been clerks or farmers or shopkeepers back east claimed to be engineers, lawyers, or military veterans. Women who had been seamstresses or domestic servants opened boarding houses or restaurants and accumulated more capital in a year than they could have saved in a lifetime back home. It was a society built on fluidity and amnesia, where asking too many questions about someone's past could get you frozen out or worse. In this environment, a person who showed up ready to work, who could do the job, who did not cause trouble, was accepted. Charley showed up ready to work. The job of a stagecoach driver, called a whip or a jehu, the latter term from the biblical King Jehu, who drove furiously, was among the most respected in California during the gold rush. Drivers did not just transport passengers. They carried mail, the only reliable link between isolated mining camps and the outside world. They transported gold dust and bullion from mines to banks, which made them targets for robbery. They navigated mountain roads that were barely roads at all. Dirt tracks carved into cliffsides, prone to washout in rain, blocked by snow in winter. A single mistake, a skittish horse, a miscalculation on a turn could send coach, passengers, horses, and driver over the edge, falling hundreds of feet. The death rate among drivers was high. Those who survived and gained reputations for reliability and nerve could command premium pay. By the mid-1850s, top drivers were earning $50 to $70 per month, plus tips. Passengers would specifically request certain drivers and pay extra to secure a seat when one of the famous whips was on the box. Charley drove multiple routes. Early on, it was Sacramento to Placerville, a key route into the Mother-Lode country. Later, Charley drove Stockton to Mariposa, a 100-mile run through difficult terrain. There was the route from San Jose to Santa Cruz, crossing the coastal mountains. There was Oakland to San Jose, and San Juan Bautista to Santa Cruz. The California Stage Company operated hundreds of miles of routes by the mid-1850s, and Charley worked many of them. Descriptions of Charley from this period are consistent. Charley was stout, compact, with sun-browned skin and a beardless face. The lack of facial hair was unremarkable. Plenty of men, especially those of Native American or Asian descent, had little or no beard growth, and in a state as ethnically diverse as Gold Rush, California, it was not a point of curiosity. Charley had bluish-gray eyes, stood about 5 feet 6 inches tall, and was described as broader at the hips than the shoulders, though again, this was not seen as unusual. Charley's voice was noted as high-pitched or throaty, sometimes a rasp. Charley wore tailored coats, handmade boots, and a broad gray hat. Notably, Charley wore beaded leather gloves year-round, even in summer, which some later speculated was to hide small, smooth hands. Charley chewed tobacco constantly, smoked cigars, drank whiskey with other drivers, cursed fluently, and gambled for stakes both small and large. Charley was known for never taking a day off after payday. The legend was that Charley would drink and gamble all night, then be too exhausted to drive the next day. This behavior fit the stereotype of the hard-living stagecoach driver and likely served to deflect suspicion. Around 1856, while tending to a horse in a stable, Charley was kicked in the face. The kick destroyed the left eye. From that point forward, Charley wore a black leather eye patch, which became one of the most recognizable features. The patch gave Charley a piratical appearance and added to the mystique. Some sources say the patch was worn over the left eye, others say the right. The weight of evidence favors the left. The injury could have ended Charley's career. Depth perception is critical for driving, but Charley adapted. With only one eye, Charley continued to navigate mountain roads in darkness, fog, and rain, a feat that impressed even the most experienced drivers. The nickname that stuck was One-Eyed Charley. Some called Charley Cock-Eyed Charley. Others used Six-Horse Charley, a reference to Charley's skill-handling teams of 6. To be ranked among the elite drivers, Hank Monk, George Gordon, William Foss, was to be recognized as among the best in the West. By the late 1850s, Charley was routinely mentioned in that company. Charlie's skill with the whip was legendary. The stories, reported by multiple sources, including passengers who rode with Charlie, were that from 15 to 20 feet away, Charlie could flick the tip of the whip to slice open the end of an envelope or cut a cigar out of a man's mouth without touching him. This was not just showmanship, it was a demonstration of control that spoke to hours of practice and innate ability. The whip was used to signal and direct horses without having to shout over the noise of hooves and wheels. A skilled driver could place the whip tip precisely where needed to encourage a lagging horse or correct a drift. Charlie also carried a revolver, standard equipment for any driver moving valuable cargo. Most drivers handed over the strongbox when confronted by armed robbers. It was Wells Fargo's money, after all, and the company preferred losing a box to losing a driver or passengers. But Charlie had a different temperament. The first robbery occurred around 1858. Charlie was driving a run between Stockton and Mariposa when a gang of highwaymen stepped into the road, guns drawn. They demanded the strongbox. Charlie complied, but did so with visible anger, telling the robbers that there would be a reckoning. This was not an idle threat. A few months later, the same gang attempted to rob Charlie's coach again. Their leader was a man known as Sugarfoot, so called because he wrapped his feet in burlap sacks, either to muffle his footsteps or because he could not afford boots. The accounts differ. This time, when the gang appeared, Charlie did not stop. Instead, Charlie cracked the whip hard across the lead horses, who bolted forward. In the same motion, Charlie drew the revolver, turned, and fired. One of the shots hit Sugarfoot in the stomach. The gang scattered. The coach raced on. Later, Sugarfoot was found in a miner's cabin in the hills, bleeding out. He died there. The story spread quickly. Wells Fargo, pleased that one of their drivers had eliminated a persistent threat, presented Charlie with a gold watch and chain as a reward. Charlie wore that watch for the rest of his life. The incident added to Charlie's reputation, not just skilled, but dangerous, someone not to be trifled with. It also meant that other gangs thought twice before targeting a coach driven by One-Eyed Charlie. Another incident that became part of the legend occurred on the Tuolumne River. During a winter storm, with rain coming down in sheets and the river running high, Charlie approached a wooden bridge. The bridge had been weakened by flooding, but in the darkness and the driving rain, this was not visible. Charlie started across. Passengers inside the coach felt the structure shifting under the weight of the wheels. Some accounts say the bridge began to collapse as they crossed. Charlie kept the horses moving at full speed, making it to the far side just as the central span gave way behind them. When other drivers arrived at the same spot later that night, they found the bridge gone, impassable. The story, reported in newspapers at the time and retold in obituaries years later, became shorthand for Charlie's combination of skill and nerve. Whether the bridge actually collapsed the instant Charlie crossed or simply was found collapsed shortly after, the story carried the emotional truth that driving Stagecoach in the Sierra in winter was a form of combat with the elements, and Charlie won. A third incident, less dramatic but telling about Charlie's abilities, happened on a descent from Carson Pass. The lead horses, possibly spooked by a snake or a sudden sound, veered off the road. The coach lurched, throwing Charlie from the box seat. Charlie held onto the reins. The horses dragged Charlie along the ground. From this position, being dragged, Charlie somehow managed to steer the horses back onto the road, then climbed back onto the box and brought the team under control. The passengers were shaken but uninjured. Charlie received a $20 bonus from the company for saving the coach and the passengers. This kind of physical toughness and quick thinking was what separated the best drivers from the merely competent. In May 1865, Harper's New Monthly magazine published an illustrated account by J. Ross Brown, a writer and illustrator who specialized in Western tales. Brown had ridden with Charlie from Placerville to Virginia City. He described Charlie's driving as miraculous, noting how Charlie peered through clouds of dust and volumes of darkness, and navigated by recognizing trees, stumps, boulders, and the horse's ears, when Brown himself could scarcely see his hand before his face. Brown called the experience unforgettable and ranked Charley among the best drivers he had ever encountered. The piece included illustrations showing Charley on the box seat, whip in hand, navigating treacherous mountain roads. At no point did Brown suspect that the driver beside him was anything other than a man. This was true of virtually everyone who rode with or worked alongside Charley. If there were suspicions, they were not voiced. By the late 1860s, the stagecoach business in California was beginning to change. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869 with the final spike driven at Promontory Summit, Utah, on May 10th of that year. Even before completion, the railroads were eating into stagecoach routes. Travel by rail was faster, smoother, and less dangerous. Stage companies that had thrived in the 1850s began consolidating or shutting down. The Pioneer Stage Line, run by Frank Stevens, bought out the California Stage Company in 1865 and shortly after that sold the combined operations to Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo, which had started as an express and banking company in 1852, buying and selling gold and operating offices throughout California, began purchasing stagecoach lines as a way to maintain control over transportation routes. But even Wells Fargo could not compete with the railroads on major routes. By the early 1870s, the golden age of the stagecoach was over. Charley, recognizing the direction of the industry, retired from driving sometime in the late 1860s. In 1867, at age 55, Charley registered to vote in Sokol, a small town in Santa Cruz County. The name Charles Darky Parkhurst appears on the Great Register of Voters for that year. In November 1868, a presidential election was held, Ulysses S. Grant versus Horatio Seymour. Charley may have voted in that election, though there is no direct record of a ballot being cast. If Charley did vote, it would make Charley the first person assigned female at birth to vote in a California presidential election, and possibly in any U.S. presidential election. This occurred 52 years before the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote nationwide in 1920, and 43 years before California granted women the right to vote in 1911. The question of whether Charley actually voted or merely registered is unresolved. The voter registration document exists. Confirmation of a ballot cast does not. Historians note that registration was one thing, showing up at the polling place was another. But the registration itself required Charley to appear before election officials, state an age and residence, and sign the register. This happened without incident. After retiring from driving, Charley opened a stage station and saloon on the road between Santa Cruz and Watsonville. A stage station served as a relay point where horses were changed and passengers could get a meal and rest. Running a station was less physically demanding than driving, but required capital and management skill. Charley ran the station for several years, then sold it. With the proceeds, Charley bought land near Sokol and tried several ventures: cattle ranching in partnership with Frank Woodward, lumberjacking in the surrounding forests, chicken farming near Aptos. None of these ventures made Charley wealthy, but they provided a living. Charley owned a small farm with an apple orchard and a 2-room cabin. The work was hard, and by the mid-1870s, Charley was beginning to slow down. Rheumatism set in, particularly in the hands and limbs, the result of decades of exposure to cold and wet while sitting on the box seat of a coach. By 1876, Charley was 64 and described as a tired old man, crippled to the point of deformity. In early 1879, Charley began complaining of a persistent sore throat. The pain grew worse. Charley finally consented to see a doctor in Sokol who diagnosed cancer of the tongue and throat. The doctor recommended surgery, inserting a silver tube into the throat to allow breathing and eating. Charley refused. Instead, Charley retreated to a small cabin on the Moss Ranch, about 6 miles north of Watsonville. The ranch was owned by the Harmon family, who allowed Charley to stay there. Frank Woodward visited regularly. So did the Harmons. By late 1879, Charley could no longer speak, The cancer had taken the voice. Charley tried several times to communicate something important to the visitors, but could not get the words out. As December came, Charley grew weaker. On the morning of December 28, 1879, Charley died. The cause of death listed on the certificate was cancer of the tongue and rheumatism. Charley was 67 years old. What happened next has been told and retold, but the basic facts are consistent across sources. Neighbors came to the cabin to lay out the body for burial. This was customary. Bodies were washed and dressed by community members before being taken to the cemetery. When the neighbors began removing Charley's clothing, they made the discovery. Charley Parkhurst, the stagecoach driver, the shooter, the tobacco chewer, the man known throughout California, had the anatomy of a person assigned female at birth. The neighbors, stunned, called for a doctor. The doctor examined the body and confirmed the observation. Then another doctor was called. Both doctors agreed on the findings. More than that, one of the doctors stated that evidence suggested Charley had given birth to a child at some point years earlier. Inside the cabin, searchers found the red trunk with the baby's dress. What had happened to the child? Whether it had died in infancy or been given away, no one knew. Charley had never spoken of it. There were no other clues in the cabin, no letters, no photographs, no documents explaining anything. The news hit Watsonville first, then spread through Santa Cruz County, then to San Francisco, then nationally. The Sacramento Daily Bee published an obituary within days. On Sunday last, there died a person known as Charley Parkhurst, age 67, who was well known to old residents as a stage driver. He was, in early days, accounted one of the most expert manipulators of the reins who ever sat on the box of a coach. It was discovered when friendly hands were preparing him for his final rest that Charley Parkhurst was unmistakably a well-developed woman. The Daily Nevada State Journal picked up the story on January 4, 1880. The San Francisco Call published a longer piece, which was then reprinted in the New York Times on January 9, 1880, under the headline, 30 Years in Disguise, a noted old Californian stage driver discovered, after death, to be a woman. The New York Times obituary was extensive, running over 1,000 words. It recounted Charley's career, the robbery of Sugarfoot, the reputation as one of the most dexterous and celebrated California drivers, ranking with Foss, Hank Monk, and George Gordon. It noted that it was an honor to occupy the spare end of the driver's seat when Charley held the reins. Then it turned to the revelation. When the hands of the kind friends who had ministered to his dying wants came to lay out the dead body of the adventurous Argonaut, a discovery was made that was literally astounding. Charley Parkhurst was a woman, a perfectly formed, fully developed woman. The article continued. The discoveries of the successful concealment for protracted periods of the female sex under the disguise of the masculine are not infrequent, but the case of Charley Parkhurst may fairly claim to rank as by all odds the most astonishing of all of them. The piece noted that for a young woman to assume men's attire and defy the dangers of the voyage to California in 1849 had in it sufficient of the wonderful, but to achieve distinction in a profession calling for nerve, courage, coolness, endurance, and physical bravery was almost beyond belief. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The reaction among those who had known Charley was a mix of shock, denial, and eventually a kind of respect. The Sacramento obituary noted that friends and associates who had known Charley intimately for a quarter century refused at first to accept even the physical evidence, requiring confirmation from multiple physicians before the fact could be believed. Some claimed they had always suspected something was not quite right. Charley's small hands, the smooth skin, the lack of beard, the high voice, the habit of sleeping in the stables rather than in boarding houses with other drivers, the absence of any romantic relationships. But these observations came after the fact. At the time, no one had said anything. Charley had been accepted as a man. Full stop. The newspapers of 1880 struggled with how to frame the story. Some treated it as a curiosity, a tale of an eccentric individual. Others saw it as a story of female capability, proof that a woman could do any job a man could do if given the chance. Still others viewed it through a lens of moral judgment, asking why Charley had chosen this path. The Santa Cruz Sentinel, in a February 1880 piece, called Charley thrifty, industrious, and economical, and concluded, "Why this woman should live a life of disguise, always afraid her sex would be discovered, doing the work of a man, may never be known." This question, why, is the one that resonates most strongly and the one for which there is the least documentary evidence. What the records show is this. Charlotte Darky Parkhurst was born into poverty, orphaned, and placed in an institution where options for girls were extremely limited. Domestic service, laundry work, sewing, these were the paths available, and all paid subsistence wages with no prospect of advancement. As a boy, Charley could learn a trade, earn real money, move freely, own property, vote, and be taken seriously. The economic incentives were overwhelming, but whether the choice was purely pragmatic or whether it reflected something deeper about Charley's sense of self is unknowable. There are no letters, no diaries, no statements from Charley explaining the decision. What is known is that once the choice was made at age 12 in 1824, Charley never wavered. 55 years. That is not a short-term disguise adopted for convenience. That is a life lived. Modern historians and gender studies scholars have examined Charley's story through the lens of transgender history. The term transgender did not exist in the 19th century, but the experience of living as a gender different from the one assigned at birth is not new. The debate centers on language and interpretation. Some argue that referring to Charley with male pronouns respects how Charley lived the vast majority of his life. Others argue that without a clear statement from Charley about gender identity, we cannot know the internal experience and should avoid imposing modern categories on a historical figure. What is not in dispute is that Charley's story is significant. It is included in California's K-12 curriculum under the Fair Education Act, which was signed into law on July 14, 2011, and mandates that the contributions of LGBT Americans be taught in public schools. Fourth-grade students learning about the gold rush now encounter Charley Parkhurst as an example of how the West was more diverse and complex than simplified narratives suggest. The Fair Education Act emerged from decades of activism by LGBT organizations and educators who argued that the exclusion of LGBT people from history curricula contributed to bullying, isolation, and high rates of depression and suicide among LGBT youth. The law requires that social science instruction include the roles and contributions of LGBT Americans to the economic, political, and social development of California and the United States. When the California State Board of Education approved revised textbooks in 2016 to comply with the law, Charley Parkhurst was specifically named as a figure to be studied. The curriculum notes that Charley was born as a female but who lived as a male and drove stagecoaches during the Gold Rush era. For some educators and historians, this inclusion is a victory, a recognition that gender nonconformity is not a modern invention. For others, it is a point of controversy, with debates over age appropriateness and whether discussing gender identity with fourth graders is necessary. These debates continue. What the inclusion of Charley in the curriculum accomplishes, setting aside the political arguments, is to complicate the mythic narrative of the Wild West. The West of dime novels and Hollywood films was populated almost exclusively by hyper-masculine white men, cowboys, sheriffs, outlaws, gunslingers. The reality was far more diverse. The West included people of many races, ethnicities, and genders. It included Chinese railroad workers, Mexican vaqueros, black cowboys, Native Americans navigating dispossession, women running businesses, and people like Charley who lived outside the rigid gender categories of the Victorian East. The myth of the West as a place of freedom and reinvention was partly true, but it was also a place of violence, exploitation, and exclusion. Charley's story fits uncomfortably into both narratives. Charley found freedom to live as he chose, but that freedom came at the cost of constant vigilance, isolation, and the knowledge that discovery could mean ruin. The economics of the stagecoach business help explain why Charley's secret held. Drivers were itinerant. They moved between routes, between companies, between towns. Turnover was high because of the danger and physical toll. A driver might work for California Stage Company for 2 years, then Wells Fargo for a year, then a smaller independent line. There was no central employment registry, no background checks, no standardized hiring process. If a driver showed up with the skills and the tools, reins, whip, revolver, and could handle a team, the driver was hired. Drivers slept where they could, in stables, in way stations, occasionally in boarding houses. But many preferred to sleep apart from other drivers, either because they were loners by temperament or because they had reasons to keep distance. Charley's habit of sleeping in stables with the horses was noted but not considered strange. Drivers were rough characters and eccentricity was common. The nature of the work also meant that Charley was often alone or interacting primarily with horses. On a run of 10 to 12 hours, the driver sat on the box, focused on the road, the team, and the weather. Passengers were inside the coach and had limited interaction with the driver, except during stops. Even then, conversations were brief. Passengers asked about the road ahead. The driver gave a terse reply. Intimacy was not part of the job. This suited Charley. The few detailed accounts from passengers who rode with Charley, such as J. Ross Brown's piece in Harper's, focus entirely on Charley's skill and nerve. They describe the driving, the road, the danger, the scenery. They do not describe personal conversations or social interactions. This was typical of stagecoach travel. The driver was a functionary, not a companion. Another factor that helped Charley maintain the secret was the era's clothing. Men's clothing in the mid-19th century was loose and layered. A driver wore a long coat, sometimes oilskin for waterproofing, over a vest and shirt. Trousers were not tight-fitting. Boots came up to mid-calf. A hat shaded the face. Gloves covered the hands. All of this made it easier to obscure body shape. Charley's habit of wearing gloves year-round, which seemed odd, was explained away as a quirk. Charley's beardlessness was unremarkable in a state with large populations of Chinese and Native American men, many of whom had little facial hair. Charley's voice, described as high-pitched or raspy, could be attributed to any number of causes. Vocal strain from shouting at horses, damage from tobacco, or simply natural variation. In a society that did not expect women to do this kind of work, the possibility that Charley might be a woman simply did not occur to most people. There is also the question of whether anyone did know and chose to say nothing. Some historians have suggested that people who knew Charley well, perhaps Ebenezer Balch, who taught Charley to drive, or close friends in California, may have suspected or even known the truth, but kept it private out of respect or friendship. This is speculation, but it is not implausible. The West was a place where many people were running from something: debt, failed marriages, criminal pasts, family, obligations. There was an unspoken code. Do not ask, do not tell. As long as someone did their job and did not cause trouble, their past was their own business. If Charley's secret was known to a few, those few took it to their graves. The evidence of childbirth raises perhaps the most painful and unanswerable questions. If Charley gave birth, when did this happen? Who was the father? What became of the child? The baby's dress in the trunk suggests the child existed. One theory, entirely speculative, is that Charley had a relationship and a child during the years on the East Coast before coming to California, and that the child died in infancy or was given up. Another theory is that the child was conceived through assault, which was a constant danger for women traveling alone in the 19th century. A third possibility is that Charley had a consensual relationship at some point and the child was raised by others, perhaps the child's father or relatives. There is no documentation to support any of these theories. What is certain is that Charley never spoke of a child to anyone who left a record, and the discovery of the baby's dress came only after Charley's death. This silence is its own kind of evidence, of pain, of loss, of a part of Charley's life that was too private or too difficult to share. The immediate impact of Charley's story was to make Charley famous in a way that had not been true during life. Charley had been well known among stagecoach drivers and passengers, respected within the industry, but not a household name. After the revelation, Charley became a national figure. The story was reprinted in newspapers across the country. It was told in magazines, in collections of Western tales, in histories of California. Over time, the story took on mythic qualities. Some retellings embellished details, the number of bandits killed, the feats of driving, the close calls. Other retellings focused on the gender disguise aspect to the exclusion of everything else, reducing Charley to a curiosity rather than a skilled professional. Both approaches obscured the person behind the legend. In the decades following Charley's death, other similar stories emerged. In Colorado and Wyoming, at least 3 different women adopted the name Mountain Charley and lived as men, working as miners, loggers, and ranchers. In Montana, a lumberjack named Sammy Allen died at age 80, and like Charley, was discovered after death to have been assigned female at birth. In the Pacific Northwest, a person named Harry Allen, also assigned female at birth, lived as a man and gained notoriety as a petty criminal. These cases were reported with varying degrees of sensationalism, but they established a pattern. The phenomenon of people assigned female at birth, living as men in the West, was not unique to Charley. It was part of the larger social fabric of a region where identity was fluid and survival often required adaptation. Charley was buried in the Watsonville, Pioneer Oddfellows Cemetery. For many years, the grave was unmarked or poorly maintained. By the 1950s, the cemetery had fallen into neglect. In 1954, the Pajaro Valley Historical Association began researching Charley's life and located the burial plot. In 1955, the association had Charley's remains exhumed and reburied with a proper marker. The plaque, made of bronze, was placed on the grave and reads, Charley Parkhurst, 1812 to 1879. Noted whip of the gold rush days, drove stage over Mount Madonna in early days of Valley. Last run San Juan to Santa Cruz. Death in cabin near the 7 Mile house revealed one-eyed Charley, a woman. The first woman to vote in the U.S. November 3, 1868. The marker can still be seen today in the Watsonville Pioneer Cemetery. A separate historical marker was placed in Soquel, near the site where Charley registered to vote. That marker states, "The first ballot by a woman in an American presidential election was cast on this site November 3, 1868 by Charley Parkhurst, who masqueraded as a man for much of her life." In 2007, the Santa Cruz County Redevelopment Agency completed the Parkhurst Terrace Apartments, named in Charley's honor. The apartments are located about a mile from the spot where Charley died on the Moss Ranch. The naming was controversial among some residents who felt that a person who had lived under a false identity should not be commemorated in this way. Others argued that Charley was a pioneer and a symbol of resilience. The apartments were built and the name was kept. Books about Charley began appearing in the late 20th century. Fern J. Hill published Charley's Choice, The Life and Times of Charley Parkhurst in 2008. Karen Kondazian published a historical novel, The Whip, in 2012. A children's book, Riding Freedom, by Pam Munoz Ryan, published in 1998, introduced Charley to younger readers, though it took significant creative liberties with the facts. These books, along with academic articles and inclusion in textbooks, have kept Charley's story alive and visible in ways it might not have been otherwise. The debate over how to remember Charley continues. Some argue that Charley should be remembered primarily as a skilled stagecoach driver. and that the focus on gender overshadows the accomplishments. Others argue that the gender aspect is inseparable from the accomplishments, that Charley's ability to succeed in a male-dominated profession is precisely what makes the story remarkable. Still others argue that Charley should be claimed as part of transgender history, a forerunner of modern trans men who also live as the gender they know themselves to be, despite being assigned otherwise at birth. Each of these perspectives has merit, and each tells part of the truth. What the documentary record shows is a person who at age 12 made a choice and stuck with it for 55 years. A person who became one of the best at a demanding and dangerous profession. A person who shot, an outlaw, survived countless near disasters on mountain roads, handled 6-horse teams with artistry, and earned the respect of peers. A person who registered to vote decades before women were legally permitted to do so. A person who lived quietly in retirement, farming apples and raising chickens, crippled by rheumatism and dying of cancer at age 67 in a cabin far from where life had begun. A person whose secret, kept so carefully for so long, could not survive the moment of death. On that December morning in 1879, when the neighbors pulled back the blankets and saw what they had not expected to see, Charley Parkhurst ceased to be just a person and became a question. How was it possible? Why did Charley do it? What does it mean? These questions matter because they force us to look beyond the simple narratives. The Wild West was not simple. It was not just white men with guns. It was not just lawlessness and violence. It was also a place where people remade themselves, where the rules of the East Coast did not always apply, where someone from an orphanage in New Hampshire could become a legend in California. It was a place of opportunity, but opportunity that was unevenly distributed and often came at great cost. For Charley, the opportunity to live as he chose required a lifetime of vigilance, of distance, of secrets. And when the secret was finally revealed, the person behind it was gone, leaving only the questions and the stories. The marker on Charley's grave says it plainly. Noted whip, drove stage, revealed to be a woman, possibly the first woman to vote. These are the facts. The rest, the why and the how and what it meant, is left for each generation to interpret according to the concerns of that time. For Charley's contemporaries in 1880, the story was a sensational curiosity, evidence of the strange and wild nature of the frontier. For readers in the mid-20th century, it was a story of female capability, proof that women could do any job if given the chance. For educators and students today, it is a story about gender identity, about historical diversity, about recognizing that people who did not fit conventional categories have always existed. All of these interpretations build on the same documentary foundation: the birth record from Sharon, Vermont, the orphanage in Lebanon, New Hampshire, the stagecoach routes in California, the voter registration in Soquel, the obituaries in newspapers, the death certificate from December 1879, the marker on the grave. The foundation is solid. What we build on it changes. In the end, the story is about one person's life, lived with determination and skill under circumstances that would have broken most people. It is about the courage to leave an orphanage at age 12 and never look back. It is about the hours of practice required to master a 6-horse team. It is about the split-second decisions that mean the difference between life and death on a mountain road. It is about enduring the elements, the danger, the isolation, and the constant need to guard a secret. It is about making a living, buying land, voting, and dying in a small cabin with neighbors nearby. And it is about how, in death, a carefully constructed life can be stripped away in moments, leaving only the body and the questions. Charley Parkhurst was born on January 17, 1812, and died on December 28, 1879, and in the 67 years between, lived a life that was extraordinary by any measure. That life deserves to be remembered not as a curiosity or an anomaly, but as part of the larger, more complex history of the American West. A history that includes not just the famous battles and gold strikes and outlaw shootouts, but also the daily labor of people who drove the coaches, carried the mail, moved the freight, and built the infrastructure that made the West function. Charley was one of those people, and the fact that Charley's life required living as a man to do the work makes the accomplishment more remarkable, not less. The secret kept for 60 years has been public knowledge for more than 140 years now. The marker on the grave is still there. The roads Charley drove are mostly gone, replaced by highways and railroads and then airports, but the story remains. And it remains because it speaks to something fundamental about identity, about work, about survival, and about what it meant to live in a time and place where reinvention was possible but never without cost.